I have a fractional appointment at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Dunedin is further south than anywhere in Australia, and a very old university that continues to have a strong interest in, well, has a strong department of preventive and social medicine, within which is an injury prevention research unit, which is what I do my training. And I came to alcohol through injury in so much as alcohol is the most sort of cross-cutting risk factor for injury. The co-authors here are Sarah Harrison, who had a training in politics and then a Master of Public Health, and had expertise in the analytic method that we use, the qualitative. And Jim McCambridge, who many of you will have heard of. He's at the Department of Health Science as a chair in addiction and behaviour change, I think, at York University, and that's where I'm going now. And I almost got there a bit sooner than I intended, because I went to Sydney Airport yesterday and they checked me all the way through, and the ticket had been booked incorrectly, and I barely made it here actually. My luggage arrived. So I think the last time I came, I looked at the last talk I had, my little NDRI file. The last talk I gave was quite a long time ago, and I also talked about D.I. Smith. Now, what's his first name? Ian, that's right. I knew it wasn't D, and I've heard that he was a tricky character, but he was prolific. I mean, he has, I would say, well, anyway, I don't know, there's at least a dozen papers, probably more than 20, concerning a sort of alcohol policy experiments. The one I spoke of last time was about minimum purchase age. WA, Queensland and South Australia reduced the minimum purchase age to, well, in stages actually, but to 18 essentially during the Vietnam War, just early 70s. And I was interested in that because New Zealand did a similar thing in 1999. I was evaluating that, and the methods he used were innovative for the time and robust still. And in this case, he's written this article, and you might just, I'll draw your attention to one or two lines. But I think this presumably reflected the mood of the time and the sort of state of affairs in Western Australia. I've used the phrase the experimenting society, which is a term that Donald Campbell used in a paper with that in the heading. Donald Campbell was a sort of mid-20th century psychologist in the United States who was one of the authors, Cook and Campbell, of the book Quasi-Experimental Design or something like that in 1979. And before that had developed the ideas of evaluating important policy changes. And he argued, and I think it's very true now, is that governments are doing experiments all the time. They don't think of it as experiments, but they're essentially doing new things with policy of one sort or another, and we don't usually learn much about those experiments, largely because we don't think of them in those terms, and governments are not used to forming partnerships with researchers. And in recent times, where they do, it's not a partnership as such. It's often with quite controlled contractual terms that permit the government to suppress the findings, which is another one of my hobby horses I'll try and avoid outing today. But I just want to draw your attention to this because I'm interested in alcohol beer. And he says, it is recommended that for a trial period of 3 months, no regular beer should be sold in a remote community in order that the beneficial effect on alcohol consumption of alcoholic problems of substituting alcohol beer for regular beer be demonstrated. So he's encouraging experimentation, a sort of, the term natural experiment gets used here, but it's not natural, it's unnatural. It's constructive. And assuming, this is the bit that I like, assuming that the expected results are obtained, the next step would be to restrict the maximum alcohol content of beer sold in North Western Australia for a trial period of 3 to 12 months. Imagine that today, right? No one would, I think no one would seriously suggest such a thing, because it wouldn't be politically palatable if they think you're a lunatic. But I think that wasn't lunacy at the time. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was on the table as a possibility. At least it was a plausible thing to do. So things have changed. I think the need for independent evaluation of government policy is greater than ever. And in the case of alcohol beer, the market is far more complex than it was in that day. So here are some products, and part of the motivation for this paper's been sort of whirling around in my head for 15 years, because I've been going back and forth to New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand I grew up in Australia, lived in New Zealand from 1994 to 2003. In that period, low alcohol beer was very common in Australia. Light beer actually captured 28% of the market in 1998, that was the peak. And it was on the back of 0.05 laws and random breath testing. But also the Living with Alcohol project was important in informing that, and Tim Stockwell's advocacy and presumably others helped promote that. But in New Zealand there was almost no low alcohol beer available. And that struck me as odd, because essentially, anyway, I'll go on. There are a few misnomers in this, so that's one of my motivations. The other one is industry statements of late. So AB InBev, which recently merged, acquired SAB Miller, is by far the largest producer of alcohol globally and produces 40% of all beer consumed in the world, right? One company. And they made statements to the effect they're committing in November 2016 as part of their SDGs, their smart drinking goals, right? So in the same year that the UN announced the Sustainable Development Goals, they had the hide to come up with the SDG, the smart drinking goals, and they committed $1 billion to it. And part of what they're promoting is low alcohol products. But it's unclear how those are meant to function within its market strategy. Now, there are three misnomers in this picture. One is, I have to explain this to people from outside the country, because Victoria Bitter is not a bitter, it's a lager. Tui's Draft is not draft, it's in a can, evidently. And Swan Lager, very little of it would be exported, right? But this is some of the marketing devices. The New Zealand products on the right-hand side there have similar, the draft issue. They're sort of commonly consumed. DB is probably the biggest one, but in New Zealand there are basically two companies now that own the big beer producers in similar situations, similar companies to those in Australia. But this is the thing that really perplexes me. The 20th century in Australia, in the 20th century, men, and it was mainly men drinking beer, certainly until the later part of it, were drinking 5% strength lager on the whole. The predominant products, all of those are basically 5%, 4.9 or 5%. And lager is a German style of beer, and that's different brewing technique. Whereas the New Zealanders were drinking 4% ale. It was also refrigerated more than the English would refrigerate it, but it was an English style beer as opposed to a German. And the lager started to be produced in Australia in the late 1900s, and someone figured out how to do it, and then it seemed to gather market share. Now, I don't have numbers, but very quickly. And such that certainly in 1980, you had each state had its lager, but it was all much the same product, despite what people would tell you. Yes, you can distinguish by taste VB from Tui's, but they're still 4.9% lager, very close relatives in the beer market. So then the other thing is the light beer, and I mentioned that the 28% of the market. The threshold for light beer in New Zealand is a bit different because of the tax arrangements, which I'll explain. The excise duty on below 3% beer in Australia is half that of greater than 3%. So that's why the products are basically 2.9%, most of the light beers. In New Zealand, that threshold is 2.5%, but again, about half the excise. And important differences are that RBT was introduced in Australia in the 80s, and in Queensland was the latest to really to implement 0.05. Well, they call it compulsory breath testing in New Zealand, which is probably a better term for it because it's not random the way we practice in Australia. But the threshold has been 0.08 until December 2014. And that was a long battle, and New Zealanders argued that the evidence from other places didn't apply to New Zealand. Have you heard that before? Okay. So then, as a consequence of that law change, the market was suddenly hit by these low alcohol products, really good beers at 2.5% or lower. But generally, bang on 2.5%. Now, it's quite hard to make a flavoursome 2.5% beer without using a lot of hops, and that's the key, that's what they do. And hops don't appeal to young palates because they're bitter. But they produced some very good products as a beer drinker, so that's another part of the motivation for this paper, because I'm interested in the products. But there were a lot of articles, and I saw them appear in the supermarkets, and beer sold in supermarkets in New Zealand. And I thought, why hasn't this happened in Australia? Why haven't interesting low alcohol products? The low alcohol products have been the same for a very long time. I'm not talking about mid-strength, I'm talking about below 3% beer. Have been the same products, and they're pretty dull and not good beer. It's not tasty beer. If people differ, they do say. So the observations were that these two countries that were colonised at similar times by similar peoples, we had slightly more Celtic peoples that come to Australia, in New Zealand more Anglo and Scottish, each with traditionally non-drinking indigenous populations. There was frontier drinking. The heaviest consumption in the history was in that first half of the 19th century, mainly spirits, because beer production requires it has to be produced locally. Transporting it long distances is too costly. And then strong temperance movements developed in the late 19th century. We've still got remnants of those in Australia, in terms of some areas in Melbourne that are dry, in Camberwell, for example. And in New Zealand, there are these licensing trusts where it's essentially a monopoly on the availability of alcohol in the Cargill, for example, in the south. And New Zealand came within 2 votes of prohibition around the time that it occurred in the United States. And we certainly came close in terms of the popularity of that within the temperance movements. So in the 20th century, Australian men drank mainly just 5% lager, whereas New Zealand men drank 4% ale. In the 21st century, which is the subject of this work, new differences are emerging. Now, I've resisted the temptation to go back and try and understand this. I'm curious about it, but I don't know how to study it, and it's probably some sort of historical project that I don't have the skills for, and it's also pretty hard to justify spending significant time on that given the way I'm funded. And then there's this new observation that the industry seems to be using them in ways that we need to understand. So the aim was to investigate the differences in relation to the public health implications, and we compared the trends in beer consumption according to sales data, or amounts available for consumption, tax data essentially, in the 2 countries from 2000 to 2016. We limited the comparison to that period because there are some issues to do with the way the data were collated prior to then that make the countries hard to compare. We systematically searched market intelligence reports, and these are a relatively new source from the point of view of public health investigations of alcohol, but market intelligence reports are produced by independent providers to business, so they're independent of the alcohol industry as such, with a view to generating insights about the nature of the market. And they're not written with public health readers in mind, so sometimes they are a little bit candid in ways that are a bit unexpected, and I thought that might be the value of this. Then we conducted a template analysis, and the coding was done by Sarah, who's the methods expert. She didn't have content knowledge, and we thought that was a useful feature to have someone who didn't come into the project with the kind of potential biases that I and Jim have had. Now, the classification of strength is the most difficult part of this because of the different tax thresholds, they're classified differently. So when we talk about low, I'm meaning those 2 levels for Australia and New Zealand. Mid-strength is really quite different. The mid-strength is a strangely narrow category in Australia, but yet it's from 2.5 to 4.35 in New Zealand, and that encompasses the really high volume product, the 4% beers that I showed you. And then full strength is greater than 3.5, which is a hopeless category for Australia. And it turns out you can't get, I'm pretty sure I've confirmed this now, you can't get the data with greater classification unless you're relying on industry figures. The Australian Tax Office does not collect the data on the payment of excise duty in ways that would permit us to estimate sales by, or available for consumption by strength beyond that category. And then in New Zealand, you've got this additional category, which is more useful, because 5% is sort of the threshold for the newer craft products being, generally stronger. So this is what Australian consumption looks like according to the ABS numbers, which come from the tax office. Overall, there's been a reduction in beer consumption. It's about 38% of sales now, and so is wine. Wine's, it's 30.5 or something like that for beer, and 38.1 for wine. And so they're about to cross according to the current trends. What you can see here is an increase over time in the mid-strength category, and a decline from in the low alcohol beer. So there's very little in the below 1.15. I mean, a minuscule amount of beer sold. So declining, it's now less than 5% of consumption, of beer consumption, whereas it used to be 28% in 1998. In New Zealand, you also see an overall decline in beer in terms of litres of ethanol. But notice this low alcohol, below 2.5%, this tiny slither at the bottom, and it just starts to increase at the end. And in fact, it gets to, I think, 5% of the beer market in 2016. But interestingly, it's dropped off again. So they're not getting what we had in Australia in the 80s and 90s. And the important, so this is the standard, this light grey category includes your standard 4% beer, and it's gone out of fashion. And it's being replaced by products with higher alcohol content, many of which are craft beers. So ethanol consumed in beer per capita fell in both countries, and in both countries it's just a bit under 40%. In Australia, consumption of mid-strength beer increased, mainly by displacing the low alcohol products. So that's an interesting thing. That's what's changed, is that people have switched from low alcohol to mid-strength beer. Now these are aggregate data, so I can't say that that's true that these are not aggregated up from individual consumption. These are aggregate sales data. But it seems likely that people have switched, where they were drinking low alcohol beer, will be drinking mid-strength beer. That would need to be confirmed with survey data, and I don't know what we've got in that regard. And that has implications for public health, including for traffic injury. In New Zealand, high-strength beer increased at the expense of traditional mid-strength beer, whereas there hasn't been much movement in the lower alcohol products. So, market intelligence reports, this is what the Euromonitor website looks like. We focused on Euromonitor because it seems the most comprehensive single source, and it had reports on both Australia and New Zealand, independent reports on Australia and New Zealand in recent times. There are other providers, IBIS is one of them. There are a couple of others that are just a little bit more constrained in their focus. But these reports, just notice the prices. These are $2,000 per report, right? US dollars. But fortunately, Newcastle didn't have access to these, but Otago had some sort of subscription to the report, so they didn't cost us anything. The final coding template, this is part of it, just to give you an idea of where we got to with, there were themes identified there were global themes, Australia-focused themes, New Zealand-focused themes, and example in the health and wellness theme, demand for mid-strength beer in Australia amongst health-conscious consumers, and low-calorie beer was a theme, not necessarily low alcohol, but low calorie. So I'll give you some results rather than focus on the template. That's part of the process of obtaining these results. The term temperance appears in a number of places in the report. It's interesting how they've adopted that term. You'll see how they use it. These were the themes that we identified. On the subject of general market trends, craft beer is typically consumed by younger drinkers who view it more as an experience. As a result, industry sources suggest that craft beer is encouraging a more moderate drinking culture. There's no evidence provided for that claim. And it's also tied up with the term premiumisation, which is a marketing term for creating a product with higher value and presumably higher profit margin. The health and wellness theme, which is evident in both markets. In Australia, Euromonitor associated with increasing demand for mid-strength beer. So it's a very different framing than in New Zealand. Carlsberg, mid 3.5%. Now, so Carlsberg is a standard beer, been produced for a long time at 5%. And it's remarkable how quickly these big providers will change their recipe in order to produce a product to fit with the regulatory systems of one country or another. And I was in Sweden a couple of years ago, and Heineken produces a 3.2% beer and a 3.5 and a 2.8% beer that's sold in supermarkets, not in the state monopoly stores, because those thresholds are agreed levels that are permitted by government in terms of tax that are permitted for sale in supermarkets. So the industry is obliging enough to produce them. So Carlsberg is one of the first mid-strength versions of Carlsberg beer, reflecting the growing demand for mid-strength beers among health-conscious consumers who are looking for premium offerings which are lower in alcohol and carbs. But note that consumption trends show displacement of less than 3% beers as well as 5% beers. So, you know, that doesn't really tally with what we're seeing in terms of the quantitative data. In New Zealand, the general temperance trend among consumers who are increasingly choosing lower strength beverages due to health and wellness concerns about drinking. They're claiming it represents a threat to volume growth in beer. But consumption of 2.5% beer did not continue growing. And I'll just show you evidence of that. This is from the Statistics New Zealand website. And these percentages here are the percentage of the beer sales that are in that light category, 1.15 to 2.5%. You can see that it sits at about 1%. Then 2004, the legislation comes in at 0.05, and it goes up, and it reaches a peak. I was wrong. It's only 3.3%, but it's declined to 2.6% in the 2 years since then. And so we'll keep an eye on it, but it looks like a flash in the pan. On the subject of legislation, Euromonitor suggested that regulation was driven by neo-prohibition. Neo-prohibition health concerns, that's the language being used, pressuring industry to develop lower alcohol products. So the suggestion was that the 0.08 reduction was encouraging demand for lower alcohol beer. The popularity of mid-strength beer, Euromonitor attributed growth in Australia to an increasing dissatisfaction with low alcohol products. In addition to appealing to men who are not seen to be drinking a weak, unmanly beer, these lower alcohol products also appeal to females, a growing consumer group for beer. On the subject of industry strategy, in New Zealand, development of low alcohol beer was seen as an attempt to tap into the temperance trend and to appeal to female drinkers. And this is probably the best bit. Globally, Euromonitor predicted the industry would increasingly focus on lower strength beer to deter regulation and deflect criticisms of social irresponsibility. The alcoholic drinks industry's potentially lucrative shield against accusations of irresponsibility. This comment seems to reflect a fusion of market strategy and political strategy. That heavier offerings should ideally be positioned as alternative options for expanding drinking occasions, the identification of which and tailoring products to cater to them will inform the future innovation. So the aim is to create ideas for occasions, for new opportunities for drinking, new contexts for drinking. So we may see a return. In fact, there's British marketing to the effect of encouraging people to drink at lunchtime. And that was a big thing in Britain, and it's declined a lot as expectations of workers have changed. In fact, I worked in Britain in the early 90s in the local councils, and would routinely go to lunch and have 4 pints. I had 2, and that rendered me useless for the afternoon. But there were people who had 4 pints at lunchtime. In terms of intersectoral competition, partly an accidental offshoot of the craft beer revolution, and partly at least a last line of defence for big beer fighting off the advancing spirits tide. Spirits will enter the mainstream and carve their own niche with the common denominator of high ABVs. Have you come across the term spirits? These are spirits-based beers. So beers with spirits added, actually. So they augment the strength of beers with some vodka, whatever. I haven't actually seen the products. But this is beer, big beer, trying to encroach on spirits. So higher ABVs could be an attractive proposition if a premium positioning can be promoted to differentiate from lower value RTDs. This is trying to displace the RTDs. So in New Zealand, high strength beer has displaced traditional 4% beer. And actually that's something that happened in the UK in the mid to late 80s. There was a change from drinking traditional ales that were predominantly 3.5 to 4% in strength to drinking continental lagers. And some of the big brands were Stella Artois, Kronenbourg, 1614, and then there was some Heineken, Carlsberg, and then there was some domestically produced Carling, Black Label, I think it is. All of them are sponsored rugby league teams in the country. In fact, all 12 rugby league teams in the country at some stage were sponsored by beer companies. And shall I get that? So that, I think what's happened in New Zealand is actually quite similar to what happened in England. We've gone from those relatively, sort of 4% products to much stronger ones. So young working class men in Britain went from drinking what their fathers were drinking, which was 3.5 to 4%, to drinking 5% and sometimes stronger lager. So from ale to lager. It remains unclear why these similar countries, Australia and New Zealand, continue to have such different alcohol markets. There's Stephen Wilkes has written this wonderful book, The Political Power of Business Corporation, which it's not alcohol focused, it's about corporate structures. And he talks about industry actors adapting their strategies to the institutional features of different countries. So there's an element of, they're essentially the same ownership of the, I can't remember the specific differences between the two of them. The same ownership, the same companies own the big beer producers in Australia and New Zealand, yet they're selling different products to essentially similar populations. So was the growth in the 1980s and 90s in low alcohol beer in Australia due to the specific conditions related to drink driving laws? This is something I've always wondered, because I've heard Tim Stockwell talk about the importance of that evidence and the taxation structure that followed it, that was based on the evidence from the drinking from the Northern Territory experiment. I assume that was one of the reasons that a driving force for drinking non-alcohol beer. Yet I suspect it's not when you look at the New Zealand experience. I think the drink driving law, random breath testing will be a very powerful motivator. What are the implications of the move away from low alcohol beer in Australia? We've had a lot of success in Australia. We've led the world in reducing drink driving, from where 50% of traffic crashes injury crashes in 1980 were thought to be alcohol involved. That's down to the low 20s now. But I'll just show you some data. So I haven't attempted to analyse this, with much depth. But this is the incidence number of fatalities in 1980 where there were alcohol involved, and it plummets immediately upon the introduction of RBT, and it goes down, but then it's sort of stabilised and it started to fall. It's stabilised, and in recent years it started to fall a bit. But then some more recent data, and this is from a company that sells breathalyzers, so I wasn't able to find but I suspect it's robust in so much that it comes originally from the Transport Authority in Victoria. There's an upturn since 2012. We've at least seemed to have stopped making progress on reducing drink driving. I wonder how much that's to do with what beer's being consumed. And so Tim Stockwell and David Crosby wrote this paper, published in 2001, and it says quite a bit about the importance of low alcohol beer as a public health success story. But it was at that point that low alcohol beer consumption was starting to fall, and it's fallen a lot since then. AB InBev made this statement, which I referred to in December 2015. Oh, so that's the end of my talk. And what I wanted to say, really, I sort of stole my thunder earlier on. I think that's the focus. Is not really about Australia and New Zealand, where we've got these marginal gains in public health in relation to alcohol, really, compared with low middle income countries, many of which have got small populations, small portions of their population drinking. So in Thailand, something like 32% of people drink. And of those who do drink, most drink hazardously. Likewise in other countries in the region. That's where these lower alcohol products might be used by industry. I think we probably need to understand how they're using that, what sort of influence they manage to wield. Thank you.